Just over a year after Yvonne first went to Kendall House, she spent Christmas at the Brent Assessment Centre. Alan Clark noticed she'd changed dramatically.
At first I didn't recognise her. She was not the same child. She was zombie-like, hands trembled. She was so docile, which was in total opposition to what we had seen from her before. She was with us a few days and we were required to administer a number of pills. The doses were stated on the respective bottles. We were given no information about what these pills were for or what they would do. And as I remember it, the three drugs concerned was a substance called camcolite, another called artane, and a third called modicate. And as I remember, the doses of two of these, the camcolite and the modicate, were quite significant.
Were you happy that she was taking drugs like that?
Well, initially we didn't know what the drugs were for. When she began to fall asleep in the middle of the day, she seemed to be quite unable to understand what was being said to her. Most of the time when she was awake, she had a sickly grin on her face. This was totally alien to the personality that we had known, and it worried me so much that I telephoned a psychiatrist who was our consultant at that time and asked him what the drugs were and what sort of effect they would have on her. And he did agree that these particular drugs were very powerful sedatives and could be responsible for her condition. He also explained that one of the drugs was to stop the trembling of the hands, which we'd noticed as a very marked symptom of her condition. That trembling at times was so bad that she couldn't hold a cup.
Dr. Colin Brewer saw Yvonne after she'd been at Kendall House for 3 years. We asked him what, in his opinion, Yvonne had been treated for.
That's a very good question. She was clearly not suffering from any disorder like schizophrenia. I saw no evidence while she was here, or evidence from her notes that she was suffering from, say, a manic depressive disorder. So I'm forced to the conclusion that her disease, that her disorder, was simply that she was rather stroppy. That's putting it mildly. She was very stroppy. And the drugs were either being used simply as a chemical restraint, as chemical imprisonment, and indeed they were undoubtedly being used in very large doses. So large, in fact, that were it not for the fact that the same dosage appears in her notes so frequently, I would have thought that there must be a misprint, that there must have been a typing mistake.
Is she ill?
Ill in the sense that she was displaying serious, aggressive, antisocial behavior that we would not see in a child who would have had a better upbringing and a better chance in life to mould her standards by.
As well as being chairman of Brent Social Services Committee, you are a doctor and you've seen Yvonne's medical file. What was she actually suffering from?
Well, this, in fact, I, in fact, don't know, and from what I can understand, the consultant psychiatrist in question doesn't like to label the children he's looking after. And one can accept that. I mean, I'm not going to disagree with how he might decide whether he wants to label a particular child's condition or not.
But you're saying there's no clear diagnosis on the records?
No.
Whether or not Yvonne's treatment at Kendall House was justified, it does not seem to have solved her problems. After 3 years, she was sent to the St Charles Youth Treatment Centre in Essex, a national unit run directly by the Department of Health and Social Security for some of the country's most disturbed and delinquent teenagers. Last September, Yvonne and another 15-year-old took over the kitchen there and held the staff at bay with knives. It took police with riot shields to get them out. Are you satisfied with the standard of care that she's had during her time in the care of Brent?
I think one would like to. I think it's to say yes. I think would basically be untrue, given what has happened in this particular case.
As a result of our inquiries into Yvonne's case, the Department of Health and Social Security is being asked to investigate Dr. Perin-Panayigam's methods of treatment at Kendall House.
We in Brent have asked the DHSS if in fact they would look into what happens at Kendall House in regard to the question of the use of drugs, to see whether it's something that ought to be done or not. I think what one would hope is that out of this there would come a general inquiry whereby the whole question would be broached on a much wider nature than it possibly has in the past, as to whether drugs really do have a part to play in the treatment of children.
Because of Yvonne's case, Brent Council are reviewing whether or not they'll continue to send children in their care to Kendall House. Kensington and Chelsea Council have also decided to act on the question of the use of drugs. As a result of recent cases not just involving Kendall House, they're drawing up a list of the drugs which must not be used on their children without the Council's specific consent. Many people who have to do with severely disturbed children would welcome the introduction of clear guidelines on when drugs should be used. The difficulty is that the Department of Health and Social Security do not keep any statistics on where, when and how often powerful drugs are used on children in care. Other experts on childcare, however, feel that simply drawing up guidelines to control the use of drugs misses the point. They say you just can't treat delinquency.
If in fact the condition was susceptible to treatment, it might be easier to argue for a treatment-based approach. Now, there is not one jot of evidence that juvenile delinquency is in any way susceptible to any form of treatment. So you do wind up with a very, very unjust situation in which youngsters are sent for indeterminate periods of time to forms of treatment which frankly don't work.
Even if the use of drugs on disturbed children was banned, except where there was a specific mental disorder, the problem of what to do with them would of course remain. Colin Brewer believes there are alternatives.
I would certainly lock the doors every time. I think that if the only alternative to locking the doors is in effect to lock up their minds, surely most people would agree that it is better to lock the door and try and do something to the mind within that secure environment. And in my experience of asking the children themselves which they prefer, that is what they would want too.
One place that does lock the doors, rather than use drugs on its problem children, is the St Charles Youth Treatment Centre. The high security and intensive staffing required in places like St Charles are extremely costly.
Hello girls. This morning we're going to do some English now, so will you turn to page...
And an increasing number of professionals believe there's a cheaper and more effective way of coping with severely disturbed children. They argue that many of these children needn't be either drugged or locked up. Instead, they should be looked after outside in the community.
How many usages are there of the word there, do you think?
Over the past 5 years, Kent County Council have been putting this idea to the test.
For the past 5 years, we've been trying to disprove the statement that a large number of English children are unsuitable for fostering, as it doesn't appear to be true in some other countries. I didn't see why it had to be true in England. So we picked what was supposed to be the most difficult group to foster, 14 to 17 years old with severe problems. And we've placed altogether 156 up to last August when we counted. And on 2 separate evaluations, it looks like over 70% of them improved during the period they're placed.
Pamela Butcher was one of those fostered through the Kent scheme. She was placed with a Blacker family in 1976 after 3 years in Kendall House. No one pretends that life with her new family was easy.
She was very, very noisy. You could see her working up to a dramatic situation and absolutely nothing would stop her. You could sidetrack her, but you were only postponing the inevitable. She would eventually blow completely, and then she would either attack one of the kids or chuck things about or make a lot of noise, stamping, rushing backwards and forwards through a room, slamming doors.